Onassis Foundation. Dublab.
Welcome to the Quarantine Tapes, a daily podcast from Onassis LA and Dublab. Hosted by Paul Holdengräber, this series chronicles shifting paradigms in the era of social distancing.
Hello?
Hello, could I please speak with Ngugi wa Thiong'O?
Yeah, speaking.
Hello, this is Paul Holdengräber calling you from the Quarantine Tapes. I'm so delighted that you could take the time to speak to us today. Thank you so much.
Well, you're welcome.
Tell me, where do I find you, and how have you been living these last 7 or 8 months of this delirious, dire, dark time? I know.
As you know, I am currently distinguished professor of English and comparative literature at the University of California, Irvine.
Yes.
So I live in a place called University Hills, which is literally on the campus, but it has the advantage also of facing the Pacific Ocean. So the Pacific Ocean is literally only 5 minutes away from my home. Yeah.
And what have these months been like for you?
Well, in a way that yeah, two things.
Yes.
First of all, it's very interesting this few months. In a way, it's as if I was prepared for them. First, as you know, I have written an epic called The Perfect Nine in English. It just come out this month, but it came out actually in Kenya last year as Keda Moyiru or Keda Moyiru, right? Now, in this Keda Moyiru, there is an episode involving an invisible foe, right, who cannot be seen. You cannot estimate where he or she is, their shape or look or anything. He is an invisible foe. So in a way, I was anticipating the current invisible foe.
So you were imagine. You were imagining it before it occurred.
Yeah, mine was an imaginary foe, and there are 99 suitors who come to ask for the hand of the 10 daughters of the original man and woman for the Gikuyu people, and since there are so many, 99 for 10 girls, they are given a task. And one of the tasks is to go back to Mount Kenya and come out pluck hair, which is supposed to cure all diseases. But this hair grows in the middle of the tongue of a man-eating foe or organ. But it's an invisible organ. Right, yeah.
So, what strikes me in what you're saying is that literature imagined it before it happened, and you've said so interestingly to my mind that you believe that writers are part of a prophetic tradition.
Yeah, actually true. If you look at the biblical prophets or any prophet of any religion or culture. The one thing there, especially those who came before the written word, their power came from their words, okay? So they were like oral poets or oral, they use their imagination to see what might happen in the future. So I think of writers today as part of that prophetic tradition. All those biblical prophets used the one thing they had. They were not wealthy. Some of them lived in desert, eating honey only, but the one thing they had was the power of the word.
The power of the oral word.
Yeah,
I always think of that wonderful line, Ngũgĩ, of Tristan Tzara, who said that thought was made in the mouth.
Who's saying? Is that one? Sorry. Can you say that again?
Tristan Tzara, one of the founders of Dadaism, said that thought, la pensée, thought was made in the mouth.
Yeah. In the same way, thought made in, that's a good one, made in the mouth.
Yeah, and how does that resonate for you? What comes to your mind?
No, actually, there's an element of truth in that because thought comes out swaddled in sounds. Okay, thought, for it to be effective, has to wear sound clothing, if you like, right? And so, literally, thought does come from the mouth in a way when you can think of it. Yeah,
I've never thought of it quite that way, but how wonderful! And you've spoken so much about orature and how it led you to literature.
Yeah, because the original, before literature, there was orature in all communities, okay? Because all communities, even before the written word was invented, so to speak, people spoke, they used sounds, okay? And so when in the Bible, St. John, they say, in the beginning was the word.
Yes.
And the word became God. I think in Hindu Sanskrit, they say the sound Om. The sound was our beginning, so to speak. So in the beginning was sound. In the beginning was word, and the word became this and became flesh or something like that.
Right,
yeah.
Right. It became something.
So we look at the primacy of the sound, yeah. And of course, for human beings, the sound comes from our mouth, our lips, our tongue, right? And that's why in many languages, like in our language, we call language the tongue.
It's amazing you should say that. Ngũgĩ, in preparing to talk to you, I was reminded, particularly with the last comment about orature, I was reminded by a book that came out recently, and I wonder if you know it, and I love it so much, a book by Lewis Hyde called A Primer for Forgetting. And he begins this way, he says, many years ago, reading about the old oral cultures where wisdom and history lived not in books but on the tongue, I found my curiosity aroused by one brief remark. Oral societies, I read, keep themselves in equilibrium by sloughing off memories which no longer have present relevance. I'm wondering how that conspires to your own theories.
Yeah, first for memory. First of all, let's be clear. All languages were oral before they became written. So there's a way in which, I think it's Plato, I think one of the dialogues of Plato, they talk about the relation between the oral and the written. But quite clearly, the spoken word or the spoken sound was prior to its signification by written symbols. Okay, so there's a way in which the written imitates the spoken. Okay,
right.
Yeah, but the spoken is always sound before it became a word. So the sound was prior to the word, so to speak, because the word is organized sound, just like music is organized sound.
Right.
Words are also organized sound. And there's a similarity between language and music in this way. Every language has its own unique musicality. This is a musicality of language which distinguishes one language from another. And you can never, although translations are great, but it's almost impossible to translate the musicality of one language into another. All right. Just like musical instrument, every musical instrument has its own musicality. Say the piano can never sound like the guitar or the violin, but you can play the same melody with a violin or with a piano, and you can tell, oh, that's a piano, but the melody is familiar. You may have heard it, played through violin. Okay. So it means that the piano has its own unique musicality in the same way as the violin has its own musicality, right? And no musicality is higher than another. For instance, you don't say, I like the piano, is the one which is musicality, unique musicality, therefore let us destroy all the other instruments and leave it to the piano.
I see.
The same really to the two of languages.
I was about to say I see Ngũgĩ where you're going, and in a sense, one might say, and correct me if I'm wrong, that knowing many languages is knowing many instruments and perhaps, creating an orchestra.
Yeah, when languages come together, just like musical instruments, when the piano and the violin come together, they can form an orchestra or quartet or any other sort of arrangements of instruments. In the same way, languages, when they come together on the basis not of hierarchy, but on the basis of a network of equals, or a network of equal give and take.
Right.
They actually can enrich each other. Right.
And in many
translations also, they can also, and they speak one language, which are called translations.
You've said something that I find extraordinary. You said monolingualism is a carbon monoxide of civilization.
Yes, I say monolingualism is a carbon monoxide of cultures.
Yes.
And multilingualism is the oxygen of cultures, because one language in a hierarchical relationship to others suffocates the other languages, literally. But in a network equal give and take, they enrich each other, right? Languages have borrowed words from other languages quite happily, yeah. All European languages, actually Western European languages, borrowed from the Greek and from Latin, for instance, okay? And those words borrowed from other languages really, they become domesticated in a new language,
right,
and become part of that language. So that way, it enriches that language, but not on the basis of oppressing another language. Yeah, right.
No, you've
so languages.
Yeah, you've spoken so wonderfully when you say, "I believe there is no big or small language."
Yes, The question I don't use minority languages. I don't, because it's like saying, once again, we get the example of musical instruments.
Right.
You don't say that the piano or the organ is so huge. It's more of a musical instrument than the three-string violin, or I recall people that we used to have one-string violin. Right? Called Wadede, you see, but they are not. It has got their musicality. So I don't like using the word minority languages. The terms which I like to use is marginalizing and marginalized. Yeah, because when you talk of marginalized languages, they're talking about a question of power. Somebody, a force, a power has marginalized them, right? And then there are those who marginalize others. So all imperial languages marginalize the languages of the colonized, for reasons. All right, they do that. Yeah.
Well,
we have to look at languages. You look at language differently. We can see that in every case of where one people have conquered another. They use the language of power to marginalize the languages of the conquered. Okay, so I use that. And a language can be a very big language, say like Hindi, and it can be marginalized by a tiny language, which is the language of imperial power, for a reason. Yeah. So I don't like using the word minority languages. I rather use marginalizing and marginalized. Yeah. Because we're talking about the question of power.
Yeah. And taking you back into a difficult moment in your life, a moment of imprisonment. How did, in fact, your imprisonment affect your very thinking about language? Oh,
yes. I was going to mention that as well when you asked me how I am doing. I mentioned the fact that I did the perfect 9 with an invisible 4 as part of the narrative. But the other thing I was going to mention is, in December 1977 to December 1978, I was in a maximum security prison placed there by the Kenya government for having written a play in my mother tongue, in the Gikuyu language. Now, for the first 3 weeks, I think, of my 3 or some months of my incarceration anyway, I was in what they call internal segregation. That is, you live in the same compound, but none of the other prisoners are allowed to speak to you, right? So you are locked up in your own place, or you keep a distance from the other prisoners, or they keep a distance from you. So I've been joking that with this with this colonization by the coronavirus, you see, prison had prepared me for the lockup. Yeah. Hello?
Yes, I am. I'm just thinking about everything you said. When you were a young man, also, you got to spend time with Langston Hughes, I read, and I'm wondering if you can give us a sense of what that was like and what that encounter was like for you.
Yeah, that encounter with Langston Hughes is actually was very important. Let me describe it to you a little bit.
Please do.
Okay, it is there. I've told this story in my memoir called Birth of a Dream Weaver, which is about my becoming a writer. I was then an undergraduate at Makerere University College, which was in Kampala, Uganda, and it used to be an overseas college of the University of London at the time, because in those days, Uganda and Kenya were still British colonies. Okay. And in 1962, there was a conference of writers of English expression, and I was invited to it because although I was in my second year, I had already published a couple of short stories, okay, and I had already written a novel, although not published. But anyway, I was invited to this conference, and it brought together all the writers in Africa, most of the writers in Africa who had already been published in English. Okay, Chinua Achebe was there, Ole Soyinka was there, Ezekiel Mfalele, was also there. But in addition to that, Langston Hughes was a special guest of the conference, right? So that's how I met him.
Extraordinary.
The most interesting encounter is when one day he asked me to go and show him Kampala, and I was very flattered going to show Langston Hughes Kampala. I said, yes, of course. And I was dreaming of Kampala is full of cathedrals and king's palaces, temples, wonderful residential areas. So I was imagining I was going to show him all those wonders of Kampala, right? So we walked, and the first place we stopped was actually a place called Holdengräber, which was in those days, it was a run-down area of Kampala next to the university. There were drunks and loud music and artisans making things and so on, And we stopped there. And Langston Hughes, I remember being very fascinated by the people, what they were doing and so on, sort of, and I was thinking, I want to show him the really good, the really modern places, the modern Kampala. And I'm telling you, you're so fascinated with just being around, that when we finished, he didn't want to go any further. You're satisfied. We walked back to Makerere. So I remember that very much. I remember how he was dressed in simple khaki type of clothes. And me, I was dressed in, oh my God, a tuxedo. I mean, and bow tie. And so I always remember this very famous writer, so simply dressed.
Yeah. What did it teach you?
Almost invisible among the people.
Did it teach
and
you
me,
something? Yeah.
I'm a correct undergraduate, dressed like as if we're going to a cocktail party, and standing out very awkwardly in this place where they're full of drunks and people brewing illegal beer and, cursing, singing, loud music, and yeah, so I always remember that one, that encounter with Langston Hughes. Yeah.
How phenomenal.
Yeah.
We were talking about orature before and how it led you to literature. I'm wondering, we were talking about orature before and how it led you to literature. And I'm curious, Ngũgĩ, can you say something more about the role of storytelling in your upbringing? You've said this wonderful line where you say, I believe the best storyteller is the one who has the anxiety of expectation.
Oh, yes. Yeah. That's why I define. First of all, I grew up in my first experience of orature or literature or whatever, storytelling anyway, was as orature, as oral, the orally transmitted story. In my book, Dreams in a Time of War, I talk about how we used to meet in one of my mother's houses, and my father, that is, I had 4 mothers, and one father. So we used to meet at each of the mothers' houses in the evening, and we'd hear, stories. Now, the way I look back on the storytelling is I found it very interesting that somebody could tell the story whose outline you all knew. And there are some people who could tell the same story and make it feel as if it was new, right? Same facts, same characters, same ending, and so on. So I come to the theory that a good storyteller is the one who is able to raise the anxiety of expectation and then fulfill it. Because you raise that anxiety of expectation and you don't fulfill it, it's very disappointing to the listener. So there are some people who can tell the same story, but they are somehow in their telling, they are able to raise the anxiety of expectation and then they fulfill it. Yeah, and that's a good storyteller for me. Yeah,
it's a beautiful way. It's a beautiful way of describing storytelling and the hope you get when you hear a story. It's like the best kind of joke where there is a punchline, but the problem with the punchline is that you're afraid you won't understand it, and which is always also a level of anxiety, especially when someone tells you, this is a very funny story. It's always a very bad, always a very bad beginning. Ngũgĩ, in closing, there is a line I want to read to you and have you react to. I once had occasion to speak to the poet, the very great poet W.S. Merwin. And he said, and Merwin said, what you remember saves you.
Can you say that again? What you remember saves you?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, that's actually very profound. Now, when you say remember, we also talk about memory, really, in a way, okay?
Yeah, yes.
And memory, we are nothing as human beings without memory. You may have seen or encountered people who, for some reason, either through trauma or some old age, have lost memory. And it's like they are physically very fine, but they are not really there, right? When they see you, they don't connect with anything, with anybody they know or any history and so on. So memory, very, very important. And if you look at colonization of any people, is an attempt to try to suppress or to bury the memory of the colonized with the memory of the colonizer. Okay?
Right.
through language and the entire naming system. I've talked about the politics of memory in my book called Something Torn and New. And one thing I found in all colonizing situations, apart from imposition of language of the colonizer on the colonized, it's also the renaming of places. So New York, when it's owned by the Dutch, they call it New Amsterdam. When the English came, they said, no, it's New York, right? But before New Amsterdam and New York, there was a name of that place by the people who lived there, Native Americans. They have a name for that place. So the new naming system buries the memory connoted by the previous name of the place. Okay. So what you remember is very important. We're talking about memory. It's memory that makes us build the future and see possibilities, because I see we have memory to compare what has happened with what is happening. And same memory is connected with imagination, because we can project the future or happening that will come in time, whether next minute or the next hour or the next year. Or a building which we imagine in the head, and we keep that picture there as memory, and then we're able to give to an architect who is able to build a house based on that image which I have in in the head, which have been retained through memory. Yeah.
You know, Ngũgĩ, I always think very strongly of this word itself, right? The word remember, which literally means putting the members back together.
Yeah, in fact, my book, Something Torn and New, in Kenya, it was published under the title Remembering Africa. Remembering in the two senses of memory, but also in the sense of putting things together. The dismembered part being put together, all right? Yeah. So I call it Remembering Africa. That's how the title under which it was published in Kenya, right? Yeah.
Ngũgĩ, it's been such a pleasure to speak with you, a pleasure and a privilege. And stay well and stay looking at the Pacific. And I hope we meet before long.
Okay, thank you very much.
No, thank you.
I really appreciate the conversation.
Thank you so much. All the best to you. Stay safe.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
To support this show and Dublab's progressive programming, go to dublab.com/support.